My name is Jennifer Allmon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Texas Catholic Conference of Bishops. First, I want to start by expressing my heartfelt appreciation for the women who just spoke on the panel preceding us. Sharing their stories and the stories of their families takes great courage, and we appreciate their advocacy on behalf of all children moving forward. So thank you very much. The Texas Catholic bishops are committed to eradicating the evil of sexual abuse in our society and promoting healing among those who have been injured by this crime. Over the past 2 decades, the reforms within the Catholic Church have strengthened communities in which the Church is present. Our programs normalize transparency and reporting. Our efforts are built on the research of experts and professionals in what is proven to keep children safe and prevent abuse. In brief, having adults educated in safe environment standards means every educated adult can be an advocate for children. More education means there are more individuals who can identify the signs of predatory behavior, which includes grooming done by a predator before abuse ever happens. Checking the criminal background records of everyone who has access to children provides insights into a person's past behavior, which can signal potentially abusive behavior. Texans are well served by laws which encourage safe environment programs, including reporting, and education in all institutions in which children and vulnerable adults are present. While good reform has happened, much more needs to be done, especially in regards to supporting survivors and healing from the trauma of abuse. The Catholic Church's publication of the names of clergy and religious who have been credibly accused of sexual abuse of a minor is an important step in transparency for survivors and their loved ones. This transparency can help bring about healing for survivors and transformation for our society by encouraging reporting and better transparency for victims to be aware. These principles of transparency and survivor centricity are also seen in the bishop's approach to civil non-disclosures. The disclosure or non-disclosure of information in civil settlement agreements involving sexual abuse claims should recognize the value of transparency and at the same time respect the survivor's right to privacy. Catholic dioceses do not enter into settlement agreements which bind the parties to confidentiality unless the victim survivor requests confidentiality specifically to protect their identity. In those cases, we will allow them to place a confidentiality waiver in the final settlement after it is negotiated. We do not demand confidentiality in our agreements, and we specifically protect our right to publish the name of the credible accusation on our website for continued transparency. So if legislation is considered next session, we could support legislation which prohibits or limits NDAs in child sexual abuse cases, especially if it follows this standard where the party paying the settlement may not request or demand confidentiality of the victim receiving the settlement. We believe following this approach is survivor-centric and helps to empower survivors to decide who tells their story and how their story is told. In 2019, Representative Scott Sanford passed House Bill 4345 in this committee, so thank you, committee. And this provided immunity from civil liability related to defamation for charitable organizations who, while acting in good faith, disclose information they reasonably believe to be true about allegations within their organization. That was an important step forward in encouraging charitable organizations and specifically churches to tell. This law is consistent with what Pope Francis has proclaimed, that in the church there is no place for abuse and there is no place for the covering up of abuse. It also promotes a just society by providing civil liability protection to charitable organizations who assist society by making these necessary disclosures. It is important to maintain this protection so charitable organizations can continue to disclose credible allegations of abuse without being vulnerable to lawsuits by abusers for doing so. It is the responsibility of our government and the duty of our legislators to encourage proactive measures to stop bad actors and provide equal opportunity for all organizations, public and private, with the ability to prevent abuse and encourage healing. Representative Leach, you mentioned that Texas is behind in some areas, and I think one of the biggest areas where we're behind is that there are some major gaps in our child protection system. Then predators know of these gaps and they use them to access our children. So I'd like to close by encouraging legislators to support legislation which will continue to close these loopholes in the background check processes for child-serving organizations. Children are safer today because of the strides we've made together. By continuing working together, the church, the state, and other entities in our community can build a stronger network to protect children. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. I do have a question about the bill we passed in 2019. I'm trying to read it here quickly since you mentioned it. In the situation where immunity would be granted to a charitable organization, immunity from civil liability, what if the charitable organization did not have clean hands?
This is for immunity for reporting the name of the abuser so that the abuser cannot sue us for listing their name on our list.
Okay.
So this is not related to
Okay.
immunity from, claims related to the abuse that the institution might be facing. That's important to clarify. So this is not to protect institutions who may have covered up. This is to protect institutions who tell, to prevent those anti-SLAPP or SLAPP or whatever we're supposed to call it, kinds of lawsuits.
Okay. All right. Thank you for clearing that up for me.
Just a clarification.
Yes, Rosie,
I mean,
of course.
I think what you said is that they can still sue for damages, and if there is a settlement based on that lawsuit, then you would not require an NDA in that instance. You would.
We don't
Obviously,
require
you
an
will-
NDA in any instance in the Catholic
Okay.
Church.
Right. Okay. So, but you would agree to keeping the victim's name and information confidential.
Yes, and typically the victims, not every victim requests it. We don't ask them if they want it. It's only if they proactively say, I know you're going to disclose Father so-and-so on your list, and it's going to be on the website, and I don't want anyone to ever know it was me. Will you please make sure no one in the church can say it was me? And then we would put in that confidentiality agreement. But we would not agree to not disclose the name of the clergy on our website because that's a commitment the bishops have made for transparency, and it helps survivors to come forward. It helps survivors to see the church takes this seriously and is not hiding the clergy.
Okay. Thank you.
So what happens now in a situation? So grew up a Baptist, still a Baptist, and I know so we have Sunday school teachers and lay leaders, volunteers at our church, and they all undergo training, especially those. I think all of them do, but especially the ones that are involved in children's ministry, youth ministry, whatnot. What happens if there's it doesn't even have to be a credible accusation, but just an accusation currently of a lay leader or volunteer in the Catholic Church? If there's someone who has gone to the leadership of their church or to one of the bishops or to a staff member and reports an instance of abuse, can you tell me what happens now in
Yes.
responding to that?
Immediately, the phone call is made to the appropriate authorities, typically DFPS, but if it's an adult reporting something, then it may be, to a different agency and to the police. And so those calls are made, immediately within the statutory guidelines of the Reporting Act, which is, I believe, Chapter 261 of the Family Code, which, by the way, earlier there was a question that passed in 1995. That's when the mandatory reporting was passed in 1995.
Right.
And so we would report under that structure, but we'd also report to the Diocesan Victim Assistance Coordinator. Every diocese has a Victim Assistance Coordinator who's not an attorney. It's not the settlement person. It's a person who's there to assist victims as they come forward. And so the referral would be made to the Victim Assistance Coordinator to provide counseling and other support.
Okay, so if for whatever reason an instance of reported abuse is not prosecuted, there's no action taken by DFPS or by local law enforcement or the authorities, but that victim maintains their position that they had in fact been abused by either an employee or a lay leader or volunteer. What does the church do in that instance? If let's say that lay leader or volunteer leaves that church and goes to another church, I'm concerned about passing the trash.
Absolutely.
Passing the trash, and we see this. In fact, this legislature has acted on it in the public education context and even private schools. What happens in the church context? Because I've read repeated instances where it just kind of goes away quietly. But then that minister, that lay leader shows up at another church and no one knows about it. No one at all.
So in 2002, the Catholic bishops passed a charter for the protection of children. And it was an agreement that all bishops in the United States made to hold themselves to these standards of accountability related to abuse claims. Under that process, every diocese has a diocesan review board that is independent of the bishop, independent of the diocese, typically former law enforcement, judges, lawyers, psychologists, social workers, survivors. And that diocesan review board reviews every allegation, reviews it thoroughly, and reports back to the bishop on their findings. And then the bishop takes action to suspend the person from ministry or whatever the appropriate action is. All of that takes place after the referral to law enforcement. So law enforcement and DFPS are always the first call, always the first referral. Then victim assistance and diocesan review board move forward with the claim. In terms of we don't maintain a statewide database across dioceses of individual Catholics. Particularly when you're talking about lay volunteers, there's 9.5 million Catholics in Texas, and so we don't have a database of all of the Catholics. But if there is an instance where the review board finds that the allegation is credible, and even if it's a credible allegation of grooming, something that is not criminal grooming, but something that clearly this person is in an inappropriate communication pattern with a minor or vulnerable adult, then that communication can be made to the pastors within the diocese. I'm not sure what happens, but I can find out in terms of the communication between dioceses about someone.
If there's, you mentioned that you do criminal background checks on anyone that has access to, so that's not just employees, that would be any volunteer.
Yeah, there's
Okay.
different levels of background check depending on your access. So, for example, my children go to a Catholic school. So if I'm going to go on a field trip with my kids at Catholic school, I have to go through the full safe environment training. And so we train 2.5 million people in these safe environment procedures and how to recognize grooming, how to report, who to report to, and again, always first to the state.
Sure. But if there's a settlement agreement that's been entered into where someone may not have a criminal background, so there's a settlement agreement that's been entered into, but there's been no prosecution, there's been no conviction, so there's nothing would show up on a criminal background check.
Correct.
But if the person who that signed the settlement agreement, or they're the wrongdoer in settlement agreement A, how do they not then end up? How do we ensure that they're not just going on to another church? And
You've just identified one of the biggest gaps in the state's child protection system. And so within the state's child protection system, you have these state agencies that have siloed do not hire lists. Do not hire lists that the state agencies operate are there for people who have done exactly what you've described. There's no criminal conviction, but everyone knows something inappropriate took place. The documentation is there for inappropriate behavior, for a boundary violation, for grooming behavior. And there's no way to track those people. And the church has the same problem.
Sure.
If absent criminal conviction, there's no way to track. But the state, for good reason, has put in place these do not hire registries. Currently, they're siloed. So predators know where the gaps are, and they exploit them. So one of the things about the Catholic Church is we engage in every sector of society. We have hospitals, we have schools, we have Catholic charities, daycares, churches. And so our HR might find that at Catholic charities, we can search the DFPS, do not hire list, and somebody pings. But if that person applies at a Catholic school, we are not allowed to check the DFPS do not hire list. We're only allowed to check the TEA do not hire list. Well, they didn't commit abuse in a school. They committed abuse in a residential treatment center. We can't find them. We run the check, they don't show up. Then we hire, we observe grooming behavior, and now because the grooming behavior occurred in a private school, we can report them to TEA and they can be put on the do not hire list because everything is siloed by agency. So we've been coming to the legislature for 10 years saying, please integrate this, please put it together. So last legislative session, Senator Kolkhorst and Representative Noble passed Senate Bill 1849, and they couldn't integrate the databases because of tech, but they could create a search engine that searches all databases and spits out an answer that this person is on the Texas Juvenile Justice Department list and the DFPS list, but not the education list in TEA. That database that search engine is still under review, still being put together. It will be 2026 before it's operable. Even when it's operable, In the TEA database, there are major gaps. 36% of the personnel in schools are not in the TEA database if they've committed these lower level boundary violations that are the precursor to sexual abuse. They can't be tracked because they're non-certified. That database only tracks certified individuals. 36% of the people in public schools are non-certified. That's 280,000 individuals who aren't tracked by that database. We're working with Senator Betancourt on a bill for next session that captures all school personnel. Now, it's going to have a fiscal note, so get ready to pay for it.
Who's working on that?
Senator Betancourt,
Okay.
as a part of his continued Pass the Trash efforts.
Okay.
TJJD has a similar problem. Their non-certified personnel are not covered. Probation officers are non-certified. I said TJJD, that's Texas Juvenile Justice Department, if you don't know. The other problem in the TJJD database is that an employee can be accused and have an allegation before them and quit and evade their do not hire list. You have to be fired to get on their do not hire list. In the TEA do not hire list, if you quit before being fired, you're placed on the list. So we'll be taking the language from the education code and putting it in the juvenile justice code in order to close the gaps. There may be more gaps that we haven't yet identified because we work in so many spaces, we can find some of the gaps. And when we do, we bring them to legislators and say, please pass a bill that closes these gaps. And so that those gaps are going to exist in each sector. And we do our best to close them and to continue our efforts on transparency that encourages reporting, because we want the predators who are looking for the gaps to realize that we're looking for them and have them not want to come and work for us.
Sure. Okay. Representative Flores.
And those were for credible accusations or actual convictions or?
Credible allegations. So there may never be a conviction in some of these cases because it may not rise to the level of evidence that will generate a criminal conviction. But as the church, we can determine that even if the courts did not find it to be criminal, we find it to be a credible allegation, and so we're going to publish the name anyway. And as the church, we have that right and authority.
But I'm talking about the do not hire list and all these different agencies.
The do not hire lists are different in each agency. So there is a due process hearing at SBEC, the State Board of Educator Certification out of TEA. And so it's a due process hearing. It's a finding of fact, but it's not necessarily a criminal proceeding. So for example, if a teacher engages in these boundary violations, the texting and the grooming, then their license is removed. Their certification to teach is removed. They're placed on the do not hire list. Public and private schools have access to that do not hire list. And when the final Senate Bill 1849 is completed, child care agencies will have access to that list. You know, all those other siloed groups will all be able to access that list.
But all the other siloed groups, do they have the same process of the due process?
They have different processes, so you'd
Determinations.
have to ask each agency what their process is. But they do all have investigative processes housed in the state agency. So DFPS has one, TJJD has one, the Department of Disabilities has one. And again, they're all a little different because of these silos. And so looking at it comprehensively, we should probably, create better consistency across agencies.
But there is a threshold for credible.
Yes, there is a threshold for credible, yes.
Chairman Moody.
Just a couple, and I appreciate getting into the details of this because obviously as a member of the Catholic faith, this has been one of the probably most painful things that we've gone through, at least in my lifetime. And so I think it is, in someone who's still very engaged in the church, we go through the Virtues program. There is a lot of training involved in that. It's even when you're just working with adults in ministry, so that you can identify other things you can still help if there are other things that you spot and spy and training in that regard. And so seeing that development, and so I appreciate kind of fleshing out the Catholic Church's position on some of these things. I have a couple of questions. And for clarity, I want to make sure that I got this right. The Catholic Church's position is y'all do, because y'all are defendants in the cases, right?
Sometimes.
Yeah, okay. So never will request an NDA.
That is correct.
That is policy.
That is policy across the United States. That is the policy all bishops in the United States agreed to in the Charter for Protection of Children.
And then you did mention, though, in the instance where a survivor would want their personal confidentiality, you will engage in that very minimal
Yes.
excising. never giving away the ability to then publish the name of the abuser,
Correct.
because that could also be captured in an NDA. Your
That
ability to
could be
release
captured
that.
in an NDA, but it is the commitment of the bishops of Texas to publish those names for transparency and to encourage providers to come to the church and let us know for the protection of children.
In this was what, 2019 when the list was published.
Correct.
Did the church face lawsuits from people that went on to the list?
We did. We had lawsuits from people who we placed on the list who were not criminally convicted or who disagreed with our definition of minor. Those lawsuits, one of them went all the way to the Texas Supreme Court in the Diocese of Lubbock case. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the church's ability to publish the names on our website in accordance with our ecclesiastical role as part of the ecclesiastical abstention doctrine, and that the clergy could not sue us for publishing the names because it is a matter of church governance and protected by the First Amendment.
So in none of those pursuits where people had credible, or at least under the church's definition, a credible accusation against them, no one's been able to be successful in removing their name from those lists.
That is correct. Their
Okay.
names remain on the list.
And y'all have resisted all attempts
Yes.
in court to remove those names
We have.
in an effort of transparency.
Correct.
I appreciate that. I want to dive into that because it has been a long and drawn out legal journey, all across the country, but obviously in each one of our dioceses as well. We've all had to kind of deal with these things. So I appreciate you going into those details with me, and certainly thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Well, Chairman Moody, I'll double down on what you're saying. Certainly, Catholics the Catholic Church has had to deal with this, but so has the Baptist Church and many other organizations. I know the Baptist Church released a list, a very similar list, and there were maybe several hundred on that, and so I share your pain as a believer and as a Christian. And I read, forget what the book was, but it was I think it was written by a Catholic bishop who was discussing the sexual abuse crisis and the response of the church, and he described it as when a child is, or anyone, but specifically when a child is abused by a priest or a pastor, someone that is in a position of trust, and uniquely in those situations, a spiritual trust. It's almost like, I think the bishop described it as you're being abused by God himself. Mm-hmm. And it creates a lifetime of not only all the wounds and all the scars and the healing that has to take place, but essentially a faith crisis, and an existential faith crisis in and of itself. And so I'm appreciative of what the bishops have done to step out and to lead on this. Same is happening in the Baptist Church, not only here in Texas, but across the nation. But there's more that all of us can do. And what I want to make sure that this committee and the legislature is doing is ensuring that, as for the state of Texas, without fail and without question, we are always, always, always on the side of the survivors and the victims, period. And I want our state to be leading instead of following other states. And I'm hopeful that the Catholic Church, the Baptist Church, the Boy Scouts, the United States Olympics, private schools, public schools, everybody will help us and aid us in that effort. And that's really what today's interim hearing is all about. Members, other questions for Jennifer?